This weekend on C-SPAN 2's Book TV, John Mueller believes the chance of a nuclear terrorist attack in the U.S. is far smaller than most people think. He presents his case in Atomic Obsession. Also, Ann Lutz-Fernandez looks at the impact of the automobile on modern society, from the annual operating costs to global warming and possible increases in obesity and asthma rates. Find the entire schedule at booktv.org and get the latest Book TV updates on Twitter.
Washington Journal continues.
Nelson Smith joins us. He's the president and CEO of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. Could you give us a sense of how many charter schools are in the United States?
There are just about 5,000, Pedro. We had the first charter school open in 1992, and it's been growing at a pretty good clip since then, and we have about 5,000 now that are in 40 states and D.C.
And how many students are enrolled in those schools?
About 1.6 million.
As far as now that we have public charter schools and they seem to be growing, how has that affected education policy?
In many, many different ways. I mean, the first and best effect is that it's provided a lot of new opportunities for kids to have a high-quality education. And that's especially important in disadvantaged areas, which is where many, many of our charter schools are. But we're also beginning to see larger kind of systemic effects when you see superintendents like Joel Klein or Arne Duncan when he was in Chicago, or in fact Ray Cortines now in Los Angeles, cooperating with and using the power of high-quality charter schools in their districts to spur broader reforms and create new kinds of autonomies for schools and new kinds of opportunities and choice. So it has both a short-term effect, giving parents and kids a new choice, and a longer-term effect of spurring real systemic reform.
62% of students, according to your information, are non-white in these schools. 48% qualify for free and reduced price lunches.
Right.
How are those paid for? Are they paid for by those who enroll in the school themselves? Do they receive federal money to do that, or state money? Or
well, in terms of the free and reduced lunch, there are federal programs that provide that to all kinds of public school systems as well as charter schools. One of the things that is true is that because many of our charter schools are in urban areas, although about 20% are other, so a lot of those urban area school systems are largely students of color. And that is, in a sense, the largest base of parents and families that have gotten interested in charter schools. So those schools and those kids are eligible for all of the federal programs that any other public school children are, Title I support, free and reduced price lunch, and special ed funding and things of that sort.
Fill in the blanks for me. The stories over the last couple of days talks about the Education Department's initiative on Race to the Top.
Yes.
When it comes to charter schools, there's something called a cap that comes into these discussions. Could you describe that for us?
That's right. There are 26 states that have some kind of cap on the growth of charter schools. It's a limit on the growth of charter schools, and they're different in every state. Some limit the amount of money that can be spent, some the number of kids, some the number of schools. One of the happy side effects of Race to the Top has been that a number of states have taken action to lift those caps, because in starting the competition, which is a competition for about $4 billion in federal support, and the applications are sent in by the governors of every state, Secretary Duncan, in putting together the package, said that you have to take action on charter caps, but also add some provisions on accountability, on good authorizing, on facility support, and other aspects that support quality and accountable charter schools in order to get the highest point score on those applications. So something like 7 states now have taken some kind of action to lift the caps on charter schools, and we expect more will happen in round 2, because only a few states will get this first round of grants, and then there will be a second round, and the department wants to see those states that don't win go back and look at their legislation this spring and see if they can then come in with stronger applications.
Is there a general philosophy from a state of why a cap would have to be put in the first place?
Well, caps, honestly, were put in place as a part of the political horse trading when charter laws were written. There were folks in the states that didn't want to see charter schools. And so they said, well, we'll try it out, but we'll make sure that there are only 10 of them or 50 of them or something like that. And some folks over the years have said, well, you see, if you have caps, you can have slow growth and you can have better schools. We've found absolutely no correlation between these caps and any kind of quality of charter schools. We find a much stronger correlation between things like good authorizing and good accountability systems and enough revenue to support operations. And that's why in the model charter school law that we published in June, those things are all considered as elements of a good charter school law.
Is there quantitative evidence that charter schools are performing to their intended purpose?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence, and of course, as with any kind of data and statistics, as your last guest would attest, you can argue from morning till night about what it all means. We know that there are a number of what are called gold standard studies that have been done in an increasing number of jurisdictions where you have a direct apples-to-apples comparison between the student that goes to a charter school and the student that remains in the traditional district. And by and large, the performance, the gains for the student over time tend to be stronger in charter schools. There's still a lot that we need to know, though. I mean, there are a lot of schools that do about as well as their surrounding districts, and yet they may score higher on parent satisfaction, or they may have a mission that a particular parent wants to see the child educated in. So we have a lot more work to do kind of to really get a handle on what makes for the highest quality schools and how we can make sure that every new charter school that's started has all of those characteristics.
Our guest is with us till the end of the program. If you want to talk to him about the charter school movement in the United States, and especially what it means for policy here in Washington, D.C., 202-737-0002 for Democrats, 202-737-0001 for Republicans. It's 202-628-0205 for independents. Journal@cspan.org is the email address, and C-SPAN WJ is our Twitter address if you want to reach us there. Charlotte, North Carolina, thanks for waiting. You're up first on our Republican line. Eddie, good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead, sir.
I have a comment and then a question for Nelson. Nelson, I'm a state senator here and also president of the North Carolina Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And we want to thank you and Todd Zebarth for coming into our state and talking about your ranking this past week. Mm-hmm. We look forward to working with you.
That's great. Well, thank you for that comment, and thank you for mentioning Todd. He's our policy vice president, and he actually led the team that created our model charter law and our new set of state law rankings. And do you have a question as well?
Yes, the question I had has to do with educators. We have about 4,000 or maybe 3,000 charter teachers, charter school teachers in North Carolina. I don't think too many of them are involved with the North Carolina Association of Educators, which is our wing of the NEA. And I just wonder, in most states, where are teachers going for their association, their continuing education? Are there states that have created alliances or association of teachers for purposes of their mutual benefit?
That's a great question. You're just beginning to see that happen in some of our state associations. The fact is the teacher unions, whatever kind of advocacy work they do, also do provide some of those professional development activities. So it's important for charter schools, whether they do it through the networks that they're associated with, if they're a KIPP school or if they're a Aspire public school, that they have plentiful professional development opportunities for their teachers, and also in terms of the way the schools operate, make sure that the teachers have a voice in determining the decisions that affect their ability to teach well. We do think that it's important, though, that in terms of looking at the question of charter schools and unions more broadly, that any kind of contractual relationship recognize the autonomy of the charter school. It would be a really bad mistake to fold charters by and large into the kind of broad collective bargaining contracts that we see in most of our big cities. So I want to encourage folks in North Carolina and elsewhere to look for ways that charter teachers can band together and express their voice and get the kind of development help that they do need. Let me just say about North Carolina very quickly, that's one of the states that a lot of people think might do well on Race to the Top because you do well in other respects. But on charter policy, as you know, Senator, the state has a very rigid cap, which it has been up against for the last 3 or 4 years, and that has to go in order to permit the growth of schools and to fulfill the wishes of the parents that are on waiting lists in North Carolina.
The way we're defining charter schools, by the way, is a non-sectarian public school of choice that operates with freedom from many of the regulations that apply to traditional public schools. Give an example of one.
Well, one kind of freedom, for example, is the clock and the calendar. Many charter schools will have either longer school days or longer school years, but they can also use the time differently in the day because they're not constrained by these sort of rigid contract rules. If a teacher, for example, needs to spend more time in the day with a particular student around a particular issue, the school can kind of organize itself to make that possible. So that's why we stress the notion of autonomy as a real ingredient for the quality of charter schools. They have to be able to be nimble and flexible in how they use their resources primarily including time in order to serve students' needs.
Since they're public schools, are they overseen by a school board just like any other school in a district?
Well, the concept of the charter authorizer is a new one in public education, and that's who actually awards the charter and oversees the school. The first oversight of the school is that each charter school has its own board. It has a board of trustees, which is typically made up of community leaders, teachers, parents, and others. But they are accountable to the authorizer, and that is the body that actually grants the charter in the first place. So in most states, school boards can grant charters, but in some states so can universities, so can perhaps state boards of education, or a state board that's created just to do charter schools, as we have here in the district, or as we have in Arizona. And that board awards the charter, decides who can get a charter, but then also holds the school accountable for performance. Usually after a term of 5 years, they have to decide, has the school done well enough to be renewed and to get another term? So that's the accountability chain for charter schools.
Fairfield, Connecticut. You are next. On our Democrats line, Dorothy.
Yes, I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
I have read a lot about charter schools, and I am a retired teacher from the inner city schools of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And I have read that the charter schools, only 17% of them did better than the inner city schools that exist.
Mm-hmm. And
I like some things about charter schools. I like the fact that they can have longer days and a longer year. I think that can be helpful. But I'm still involved in the schools, although I'm retired for a long time. I'm a volunteer in a new school in a nearby city, and I see some wonderful teachers, amazingly good teachers at work in these schools, and I think that there's too much criticism of inner city schools and the teachers within them. One question I have is this. Charter schools like the KIPP schools, are those profit or non-profit schools?
They're non-profit schools.
All the charter schools that are run by, similar to KIPP, are they non-profit?
When you say similar to KIPP, first of all, almost all charter schools in the country are actually non-profit organizations. A small percentage of charter schools then contract with what are called education service providers, and that may be KIPP, which is a nonprofit. It can be a company like Edison, which is a for-profit. But all of that together is about 25% of all charter schools. And in almost every state, the school itself is a nonprofit corporation, and they make the decision about what kind of services to use to actually provide management. But I would suggest, if you're in Bridgeport, Dorothy, take a ride down to the Achievement First School. I was just there a couple of months ago, and that's a wonderful example of an inner-city school that is doing magnificent work with the same kids who down the street at a traditional public school have not been doing well. Achievement First is one of those networks of nonprofit education service providers that now has, I think, 6 or 8 schools in Connecticut and New York City. And the achievement results that they're getting are really spectacular. And it all comes down to the expectations that they have for the kids, the fact that they are able to use their resources in a very flexible way, and the fact, frankly, that they also, especially in New York City, have terrific policy and political support. They've been able to make new schools in New York City partly because the Chancellor of New York City, Joel Klein, really wanted to see New York become the Silicon Valley for charter schools. And so there's good authorizing, good policy, facilities provision, and other kinds of support that enable a school like that to do great work.
What factors go into people deciding they want to start a charter school?
All sorts of things. Very often it's educators who feel that they're constrained in the traditional kind of district schools, and they have a great idea and they want to implement that vision. Sometimes it is a community organization that might have had a long history of service in other kinds of social service fields, and they realize that a lot of the problems that they're dealing with really originate in education. So they decide that they've got to create a school. And sometimes you have some of these networks I've mentioned which have tremendous records in other areas, and now states are inviting them in to take the model that they've developed elsewhere and try and replicate it in their area that has a lot of need. So in that case, they have to get together with local community leaders and parents, and they have to basically sell them on the idea but that model can then take root in that new district.
From Durham, North Carolina, Republican line. Scott.
Good morning, Mr. Smith.
Good morning.
My name is Scott Owen, and I represent the Board of Directors of Kestrel Heights Public Charter School in Durham, North Carolina.
Great.
And I have a brief comment and a question for you, and I appreciate your advocacy on behalf of the charter school movement. We really appreciate it, sir.
And yours as well.
Thank you, sir. As the previous caller from North Carolina, Senator Goodall, state senator, called, and we've worked with him to help press our position for charter schools. But what we're coming up against in North Carolina is the State School Board of Education has implemented new policies that are requiring a greater than 60% performance 2 consecutive years in a row towards the charter school movement. And what we're trying to get their attention is that we have a lot of charter schools. We're a minority-based charter school in Durham, North Carolina. And so we're very diverse in our population, but these new standards that go into effect are going to cause some of our brother and sister charter schools that aren't performing so well to be closed. And just in case you're not aware of, what's going to happen is with the traditional public school system, they're going to be placed disproportionately back into an overburdened and overcrowded traditional public school that are not meeting the standards. So we've got a dual problem here. We're shutting charter schools down. Then where does it end in terms of, okay, for those schools that are borderline, are we going to become the new front line? And we understand the race to the top provisions in terms of getting funding and so forth, and we support the state school board's efforts to tighten up performance standards. We understand that, but we need to have a little bit more empathetic position in terms of what do we do to these kids that come from broken families, and where do we provide assistance to them? And if we disproportionately put them back into a charter school system that's overcrowded and not performing well, we advocate that why aren't they putting standards on the traditional schools that are being implied and put on the public charter school system?
We'll leave it there.
Scott, you raise a number of different issues there, which actually have a lot of resonance in other states as well. So let me try and just be kind of succinct in the answer. The first thing to remember, of course, is that charter schools are public schools, and so they are subject to state standards, and that includes the sort of federal issues that are imported into state standards through adequate yearly progress and things like that. What we're moving toward, though, is a system of accountability in many states where you don't measure just how the kids do on a specific test score on one day, but their growth. So that if you do have kids who come in who are way behind in the public school system, the task that should be measured is how far you can advance those kids while they are in your school. And I think that really should even out the playing field between schools that have been in place a long time and relatively new charter schools that are starting with student populations who come in way behind the curve. The other thing, though, that you touch on is the whole question of the closure of charter schools and what happens to those kids afterwards. Part of the accountability measure for charter schools is that if they don't meet standards, if they don't really meet their own criteria, their own charter standards, that someone else gets the new management of the school. And sometimes it's a really difficult decision because, as you say, the option may be for that child to go back to a district school that has not served that child well in the first place. So that's what a good authorizer does, actually, is to try and make those close decisions so that the best interests of the children, the interest of academic achievement, and the interests of families are all served at the same time.
Question off Twitter. Mr. Smith, would you say a charter school would be as good or better than private schools?
You can't answer that question because what you have to look at is the charter school you're looking at better than the private school that you're looking at? And that has a whole bunch of questions associated with it. Of course, private schools charge tuition. Charter schools do not. Private schools do not have to meet state standards, except in a very broad sense. Charter schools are obligated to take those same tests as all other public schools. The essential question that you should be looking at is, how is this school going to do in terms of my child's needs? Is this school going to do a better job of putting my child, for example, on the track to college, or of cultivating my child's interests in the arts or citizenship or something like that? You often find those kinds of themes in charter schools, but you have to do a little homework. You have to look at whether the choice makes sense in terms of the child's interest and situation, and really in terms of the school's track record.
Do vocational schools fall under charter schools?
There are a lot of charter schools that are doing great things in that area. I mean, there are some schools that, for example, open up to serve kids who have dropped out of other public schools. And very often you'll see those kids on a track, let's say, to a community college, or working toward even a 4-year degree, but meeting sort of where they are. And there are other schools that actually have functional themes. You're seeing a number, for example, of green charter schools, and you're seeing a number of schools that are associated with biotech industries or things like that. So it's not the traditional voc ed kind of picture, but it's really preparation for sort of the higher level 21st century workplace.
Watertown, New York is next. George on our independent line.
Hi. You just kind of hit on what I was going to ask you about, on whether or not you planned on extending into like a BOCES programs and things like that. The problem here is that our kids are coming out of high school with absolutely no training on any job at all or any way to find a job. So we're having a problem here with that. And when we go to hire people here, because I do hire people once in a while, they have no experience whatsoever in what I'm trying to hire them for. Second thing I would like to say is, would you be in favor, I know this isn't what your specialty is, but would you be in favor of claiming that if I hire a 16-year-old kid for the summer, that part of the $7.50 an hour I'm required to pay him is actually $1.50 worth of training that this child is getting towards this job? So basically, if I pay him $6 an hour plus the $1.50 of training that he's receiving as a compensation for that, wouldn't that make it easier for me to hire this kid?
I love the idea. I love the idea. And there should be no reason why you couldn't work out an arrangement like that, either with your local public school or if a charter school could maybe even be started in the neighborhood in Watertown there to capitalize on that kind of arrangement. I think the real issue here is that, every student needs to be ready for post-secondary work and adult life, whether they come out of a charter school or another kind of public school. The problem that you talk about is really widespread. And so one of the things that we've done when we've talked about creating standards for charter schools that are common to all different kinds of schools is making sure that the students are really ready for post-secondary attainment. So we mean principally ready for college, whether it's a 2-year or 4-year college, but also productive participation in the workforce, or if they're going to go into the military, that they have the skill level needed there. But these days, the differences are not so great between the student who is going to work at what we used to call a trade and what we now call professional work. You all have to know how to use computers. You all have to know how to do billing. You all have to know how to do statistics and calculation and evaluation. So I think that you've hit on a very important question, and my suggestion to you is if New York ever does succeed in lifting its charter cap in the next session of the legislature, perhaps, think about teaming up with some folks in Watertown and starting a new charter school there that would meet those needs.
If they're different and specialized, how do elements that were laid out in No Child Left Behind work from school to school in these charter schools?
Well, No Child Left Behind, of course, prescribes it really requires that states create accountability systems and then hold all public schools accountable to those levels. So charter schools have to make adequate yearly progress. They're subject to the highly qualified teacher rules and all the other bells and whistles of No Child Left Behind. As I said, I think the important thing for us is that when you see that legislation reauthorized, and it will have a different name, it'll be the Elementary and Secondary Education Act next issue, you will probably see a change in the accountability structures to measure not just what we call proficiency, what do you get on that test that one day, but also growth. And for so many of our kids, and we have ample documentation of this, that come in behind the curve and behind their peers academically, we want to see that the schools are moving them ahead at a faster pace. And happily, that's one of the things that we do see in a lot of the data about public charter schools.
Your bio says that you were brought in under the former Education Secretary Rod Page to look at No Child Left Behind. How would you grade its performance?
I give No Child Left Behind strong marks, and I think that, I know there's not exactly unanimity of opinion on that. I think the great service that legislation provided was to make clear that there are achievement gaps in this country. Until No Child Left Behind, states and districts were able to just put out big averages of how they're doing and conceal the fact that there were populations of kids, poor, low-income kids, minority kids, who just were nowhere near the achievement level of their majority colleagues. So it's very important, first of all, to establish that and to say that we have to hold states accountable for taking action on that. Now, I think where we've gotten into some deep water is actually the implementation of those accountability measures. And
The
I
whole
think you're gonna
teaching
see
to the test concept? Or?
the whole notion that all performance is reduced to reading and math scores, although I'll tell you that there is no better indicator, especially in elementary school, of whether a school is doing its job as to whether kids are actually testing on grade level in those core subjects. So I think there's no apology needed for that. I do think we're going to see some changes in the implementation that will allow states to have a bit more judgment in how they hold schools accountable.
Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for our guest Nelson Smith of the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools.
Good morning. How are you, gentlemen?
Good morning.
Perhaps I'm somewhat naive, but I do understand that in our country our education system is failing and our students are falling further and further behind in comparison to the rest of the countries in the world, many of them anyways. And I'm wondering, why does the government have to be involved in education to begin with? Wouldn't it be best for each child to be provided, say, a voucher, and they would take that voucher and go to any school they wanted to go to? And my feeling is the competition would greatly solve the current problem we're experiencing in public and education. And the government does not do a good job in managing anything as far as I'm concerned. And so my question is, too, why can't it be simplified and just be, the best schools survive, the ones that aren't doing the job don't?
That is a very interesting question, and I would say, first of all, that it's long established in American public policy that going back to the mid-1800s, where the first land-grant colleges were established, the government has a role in promoting high-level education for all of its students and all of its children. And so there are reasons to have the government involved through funding and through a certain amount of oversight and so forth. But your question goes to one of the strands, if you will, of the broader question of parent choice in education. Going back to 1923, a Supreme Court decision named Pierce established that parents have the right to choose the school their child will attend. And what you suggest is that they ought to be able to take that voucher and go to any kind of school. And you actually have programs like that in a number of places, and some of them work really well. What I like about the charter concept is that it marries that notion of choice, because the student takes the money with him or her when he moves from one kind of school to another, with a certain level of accountability, because these are in fact tax dollars. So the parent has the choice, but the taxpayer and policymakers and the rest of us have some assurance that the schools that those kids are going to are meeting certain kinds of standards. And that's why we say that charter schools are an essential part of the delivery system in public education. But I think that you raise a question that a lot of parents feel is important, and vouchers are certainly part of the larger equation of choice.
Granby, Connecticut, Democrats line. Mike, go ahead, please, for our guest. Move next to Birmingham, Alabama. On our Democrats line, Tyrone. Go ahead.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Good morning.
Caller, you're on. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hello.
Just go ahead and talk, caller.
Good morning.
We must have a misconnection.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm a school teacher from Houston, Texas. I taught in an inner city school. I believe in the voucher system.
Caller, you have a delay on. You should have your television up, but just go ahead and finish your statement.
I believe very strongly in the voucher system. I worked in a very distressed junior-senior high school here in Houston, and the best thing that could have happened to those kids was close the school, give them a voucher, and let their parents take them to the schools of their choice. The Catholic and Baptist churches are chomping at the bit to come into these terrible neighborhoods and set up small private schools where the children's individual needs can be met and their parents can get a whole lot more support. I also believe it's unconstitutional for the federal government to be involved at all in primary school or secondary school education. It is the power of the states to run the educational system, not the federal government.
Well, again, I think my answer to that would be if that works for those kids, go for it. I have no objection to that. I do think, though, that in many parts of the country, it is politically untenable to set up the sort of system that you're talking about. A lot of folks, a lot of Democrats especially, but a lot of folks just don't want to see public money used for private or religious schooling. That said, I think what we're seeing now, especially through some of the turnaround provisions that we see in this Race to the Top competition, is the ability to take a neighborhood like you're talking about, where you have some large dysfunctional schools, and put new